off my camera because I think my internet connection is a little slow. There's notes in the chat that I keep freezing. So I'll keep my camera off. There's a and I won't be looking at the chat, so I'll leave it to you to tell me when to stop and answer questions.
Got it.
Thanks everyone for being here. Some of you might have attended at Montreal Polytechnique yesterday, which is identical to what I'm going to say today, with a little more detail and discussion. But hopefully is new and exciting for most of you. So sort of, the way I like to start this talk is reminding you about last time that you were doing some sort of an activity and an idea occurred to you and you were excited about that idea, but you needed to wait a bunch of time until you get to a situation where you can actually try that idea out. One thing that happens to me very frequently is that I'm out jogging and an idea occurs to me. I usually stop, pull out my phone, type that idea, and then wait until I get home, sit at my computer and try to do that. But wouldn't it be awesome if, as I'm running, as I'm jogging, I can just talk to an agent on my phone, tell it what I'm trying to do, what my idea is, and the agent just goes out, researches things, finds information, presents them to me, and asks for my feedback, and we just interact. Even as Wojciech just showed some ideas, and by the time that 5K, 10K is done in an hour, I get home, I have a script ready for me to play with, right? So that's a bit very near future, actually. So let's get into what this means. So I've been recently going around talking about knowledge ops. And in my mind, knowledge ops is this next stage where we create automation using information seeking agents, the way we've been doing that with DevOps and MLOps over the past decade or so. So there is a dictionary definition of knowledge ops that I made up. It is mouthful, so I'm going to go through it little by little. I talked about this in the last workshop as well. So some of them might be repetitive, but hopefully it's slightly new point of view. So knowledge ops is the management and organization of an organization's knowledge assets and processes to increase efficiency and effectiveness of information-intensive tasks. Lots of jargon and big words. So let's look at what they mean. So let's first think about what does information-intensive tasks means. So what are some of the examples of this? All of you are here. Either you know about LLMs and you're using them, or you want to learn about them. So imagine if you had an agent called, for all intents and purposes, let's call it Sherpa, just a random name I picked. And for those who are less familiar, Sherpa is actually the shepherds that live in Tibet. And when people want to climb Mount Everest, these shepherds are to guide people to essentially the climax of the trip. So let's say you want to learn about LLMs. This is an information-intensive task. Like you have to consult a bunch of different resources, find a bunch of information, and learn from those. So let's say if there was a user experience available to you where you could talk to Sherpa and say, this is what I'm trying to learn, and Sherpa would go out, find a bunch of information for you, comes back and presents them to you, and you can provide feedback to it. And then you start learning from it and interacting with it. It can update your learning path. And then whenever you have follow-up questions, you go back and talk to it again, and you repeat this process, right? This is an awesome thing that I would love to have on my phone when I'm running. I've been joking about having a podcast assistant that at the beginning of my run, I say, this is the topic I want to learn about today. instead of giving me a bunch of cold material, just give me some information, I'll give you feedback, and we interact as we go. So this will be pretty awesome. If somebody builds it, I will buy it right now. On 2 or 3 runs, learn enough about LLMs, and you're like, oh my God, I gotta build something with this. So the next step is in your 4th run, you tell Sherpa, okay, I have this idea. I want to create this agent. I want to create this app that does automatic statistical analysis and research. And Sherpa goes out and finds a bunch of information, presents them to you. You provide feedback about it, and you say, okay, can we get some starter code going? You provide all of that, and running, so it is reading all of this to you. And by the time that you get home, you have a starter code of all of this. So then you start typing to Sherpa saying, let's change actually this part, let's do it this way, etc. And you just do the iterations. You might actually pick up the code and run it, and do some observations, and based on that, go back and get more feedback. So let's say you do this a few times. So this is week 2. You already have gotten the MVP of this going, and you're excited about it. You go out for a run, and it occurs to you, wait a minute, should I post this on Hacker News and get people excited about it and build a business out of it? So again, you talk to Sherpa and you say, this is a product idea I have. This is what I think is the business opportunity. What should I think about? So Sherpa goes out, uses the internet and other tools to find information, and tells you, this is how you should approach taking a product like this to market. By the time you get home, based on the interaction, it will write a document for you. In this document is a go-to-market plan. You can interact with this document. You can ask Sherpa for follow-up information and interact with it and keep going. So at this point, hopefully, you see what I mean by information-intensive tasks. Like, these are tasks that you have to find a bunch of information from various resources and combine them into something that is relevant for an activity that you're doing. So now let's go back to the first part of the knowledge ops description. So management and optimization of organization, knowledge, assets, and processes. So by knowledge assets, what I mean is data, code, tools, and documentation, right? So Wojciech just showed us an example of how you can interface with your data using large language models and code as well. But you could imagine doing the same with other things. And in his case, he was using a Python interpreter as a tool, but you could imagine that a system like this can interact with any type of tool. The other side of it is the processes. And the processes are things like communication, collaboration, and project management. I'll give you an example. Like, Sherpa is not completely random. It is the assistant that we are building. And in a lot of my R&D meetings with my team, I might say something that is half-baked and I'm not very capable of communicating that well. I go back, I talk to Sherpa, I Sherpa document to the team, and everybody understands what I wanted to say much better. So, we are starting to see how agents could really help us collaborate better, communicate better, and even manage our projects better. So, I gave this talk last time. I compared knowledge ops to DevOps and ML ops. So I'm going to fly through this next part very quickly because some of you have seen it. If you're not, please go to the last talk I gave about this. I'm sure you'll find some interesting things there. But essentially, what I proposed last time was that DevOps is, an example of knowledge ops. In DevOps, we are trying to automate testing, quality, and performance evaluations. And in the process of DevOps, we usually talk about this infinity loop where we discover things, build them, test them, and refine them. But the problem with DevOps is that the step of discovery and planning is manual. And when we are dealing with models and data, this manual step becomes a little problematic. So we came up with ML ops, where experimentation, data, and model handling became more automated and streamlined, and that ML ops. So, we sort of opened infinity into double infinity, where we explicitly try to handle data and models in an automated way so that it is less likely to be problematic. But this sort of creation ideas and planning of those ideas, the other way around, planning ideas and then creating them still remain pretty manual. So essentially, the idea of knowledge ops is when shift further left and create automated and streamlined tools for exploration, planning, and coding of ideas that we have. And therefore, the double infinity becomes a triple infinity, where the steps of interpretation, and convergence becomes also automated, or at least significantly augmented. And last time I introduced this concept of continuous exploration, added to the usual continuous integration and continuous delivery. So I think going forward, we will be talking about CE, CI, CD, a concept that closed the loop really for us, because if we explore ideas, build them and integrate them quickly, deliver them, measure them, and repeat, then we actually have something interesting on our hands that is actually an infinite loop that can go much faster than we currently do. So, again, like I also presented this set of industry trends that gives me confidence that this will happen before, where I talked about tools that we use for knowledge building. They're usually static and just contain whatever. And even the tools that are newer and fancier still are pretty static, and the information in them is pretty much whatever we have provided. There are some of these tools that are adding AI layers, but fundamentally there is still knowledge bases that are static, and you add information. So there is another trend that has been happening where we are seeing specialized semantic search and recommendation tools, and also obviously the trend of generative copilots. An interesting thing is that they are overlapping. Like Wojciech's talk was a very good example of retrieval systems and tool users like Python interpreters interacting with a GPT-like system, which is a generative copilot, to create a system that is much more interesting. So now the question is, where is this trend going? Like, what's next in this evolution? So in order to have an agent like the one that I talked about earlier, really, if you think about a system design, we need three types of skills in this agent. One is languages, two, the reasoning, and three is tool use. All of these are fortunately available through large language models. So let's take a look at how this actually pans out on this podcast I'm listening to. And separately, I'm working on detecting answer as my project. And it occurs to me, wait a minute, I could potentially use visual transformers for this. So instead of waiting to get home and use all the tools that I'm showing on the top right to essentially try out this idea, I would start talking to the agent right away. And the agent interprets my objective of creating a notebook to this idea.
Amir, could you repeat the previous 30 seconds? You were out entirely for those.
You can keep track of everything using. Oh, okay. Run back. So it's a slide from scratch.
Yes. Yes, please.
Okay, am I back?
Yes, you're back.
Okay, great. Sorry, my internet is a little shady today. Don't
worry.
Okay, so confirm that you hear me now?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, great. All right, continuing. Okay, so I'm on my run on a podcast. I hear about visual transformers, and I think to myself, wait a minute, I'm working on detecting lung cancer through lung images, and I should try out VIT on it. And I need to get home and use all of these tools to try out that idea. So instead of waiting until I get home, I start talking to the agent and say, okay, my objective is to create a notebook to try this idea. And this notebook interprets that objective and comes out the project. For instance, some Slack conversations we had or some code wrote, etc., etc. Then it will prioritize these tasks using its skills for reasoning. And then eventually it will use these tools actually to execute these tasks and keep track of the tasks and observation data in a memory so that we can refer back to them. Will reflect on these observations. And then it will ask me for feedback once in a while, and this loop keeps happening. Means is that it will
Yeah,
oh,
you're still
am I
cutting off a bit.
breaking? All right.
It's shifting to your mobile.
Okay,
hotspot.
1 second. I'm going to change my connection and come back.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Yep. Give me 1 second. The universe
Metric knows
is
this is top
preventing
secret.
me from automating
Hey,
all
yep.
of you out. Sorry, give me 1 second. Does anyone know any good jokes?
Internet allergy. That's very sly.
I know some jokes. Morning, but I know some jokes, but they're not any good.
Don't.
That's
Right,
what you want.
I'm
I can
back.
do that.
Okay.
Amir saved you all from my humorless joke.
Okay, can you hear me fine now?
A
Yeah.
lot better.
Okay, I'm gonna start this slide again.
From the top.
Seriously, it doesn't want me to do this. All right, so as you can see, this slide is talking about a very iterative process, and I'm doing it in a very iterative way to really drive it home and make sure that you all understand it really well. That's completely on purpose. It's not accidental at all. Okay, starting over. So I'm out on my run. I hear on a podcast about visual transformers. And since I'm working on this cancer detection project, I think to myself, I should go home and use all of my tools to figure out how I can detect cancer using visual transformers. Instead of that, I talk to my agent. My agent figures out what kind of tasks are necessary for this objective. It prioritizes those tasks using its reasoning skills. It executes those tasks using all of these tools and keeps track of everything in a memory. It reflects on what it has done so far and what we have achieved for consistency purposes. And occasionally will ask me for input if it needs to ask a follow-up question or just in general to get me to add nuances. And as I said, jokingly, this is a repetitive process, not jokingly, where I can figure out how I'm doing, how I can do this project by iteratively providing feedback to the system that will refine tasks, reprioritize them, execute them, observe them, and get my feedback again. And this can happen repeatedly until when I get home. And as I said before, I have a Jupyter notebook ready for me to go. So This is something that we've been developing, and for the past few months, and in the past 3 weeks or so, we're seeing a lot of similar ideas that are popping up, like AutoGPT, Baby AGI, Microsoft Jarvis, and I'm sure something came out this morning as well. So the idea of all of these projects is pretty much, some variation of this idea. They don't all necessarily have all of these steps, but they have some version of them. So you might ask, how do you achieve all of these using large language models? I can go through the repo and show you some examples, but for sake of argument, I picked one of the examples, which is the step of reflection. So in this step, we are essentially prompting the system and saying, the AI agent has found a bunch of information, provide thoughts, reasoning, plan, and criticism about these thoughts, and use those to suggest a resolution, right? So this is the step of reflection. And, we know at this point pretty well that a prompt like this will follow the instructions, will provide some information, and this information can guide the next steps that the system will do. Again, like if anybody has questions or interested, we can go into more details into the, for example, AutoGPT repo that I have open, ready for discussion. But this gives you a sense of how we essentially construct a system like this, mostly with just prompting large language models and their ability to write code to interact with different types of tools. And these tools are actually tools, but they could also be, as we discussed in Wojciech's talk, different types of smaller large language models, right? Like, or actually small models. Like it could be a regression file. It could be calling Wolfram Alpha to do some math for us. It could be calling Hugging Face to pick the right the right model that we can use. Actually, one of the things that I forgot to mention is Hugging GPT, which is exactly a system like this that calls the right GPT models to use. Sorry, the right Hugging Face models to use in a particular scenario. So how are we using this at Aggregate Intellect? So, there's been many cases in the past few weeks where people message me and say, for example, I want to create a teaching assistant for a course I have. This is actually a very common question that I'm getting. How can I do this with large language models? And 15 minutes after that message, I send them a variation of a document. It could be a Jupyter notebook. It could be a proposal that explains to them how this can be done. And pretty much, this is what our system is doing behind the scenes to generate that notebook. And, since we also have a very large community, normally if they're interested, we can connect them to our community to even get implementations of those ideas. So sort of like the big picture here is that a combination of an engaged community and a tool like this could be extremely powerful to allow people to try out their ideas very quickly. So sort of like I went through many definitions of knowledge ops, but I think that the one that is most exciting and interesting for me is this one. Creating systems, processes, and collaboration tools that make it very easy for anybody to try out any random idea they have. So at this point, I'm going to pause and take questions. Again, like as I said, we can get into the code and look at how they're doing different types of prompting. For example, in AutoGPT, I can't show our own code, but we can look at a similar example if anybody's interested. But happy to take questions.
All right, I'll kick things off. In creating like the jogging analogy that you gave, where you can just take this out and start asking questions and have a discussion. The three value adds that come to mind from here is that, first of all, it's going to be faster in researching the idea or the experiment. It might give you better results, would be number two. And then number three would simply be you'll have a less headache of formatting all the results in a way that's easily shareable. Which of those three is, in your head, the biggest impact point for something like this?
Sorry, could you recap the three options again quickly?
Faster, better, and less headache of formatting to share with colleagues and stuff.
Right. I think it is really a bit of everything. But the reason that I brought up DevOps and ML Ops is that they're very specific. Like, you could talk about the details of them, but on a super high level, what DevOps and ML Ops allow us to do, I didn't, explicitly point it out, but there are market reports that specifically say the value of ML Ops is the fact that we can move fast and break things, right? Like we can try out ideas very cheaply, see what happens, and then try the next idea. And the whole, set of tools, automations, and processes and streamlinings that we use is to allow us to test different software changes and see what happens. And I feel like, or I hope, or my vision is that the same thing can happen for information-intensive tasks, knowledge-intensive tasks, like, designing a new thing. So it could be faster. It must be faster. It must be a little better. Not necessarily even better, but it will be definitely cheaper from many different points of view, right? Like the fact that we see on Twitter these days, people spin up a whole project, a whole app over a weekend, just using systems like this and Zapier, and start making money from it 2 days later, is powerful, is democratizing, is enabling, empowering. And what that does is that you don't have to have access to financial capital and social capital to be an entrepreneur. You could be a solopreneur in a very disadvantaged place. As long as you have access to the internet and you're creative enough, you can try out an idea, put it out there. If it flips, if it doesn't work, okay. Next weekend you're going to try it again, right? So it like that's the aspect that is a lot more interesting for me than things like, would it be faster, would it be better, etc. I think that the significant point here is that trying out ideas is much cheaper now.
Makes sense. Farhad and William ask a question that really boils down to, can this produce implementation-ready code?
Well, it will depend on, it depends really on the tool you're using for code generation. Like, you probably saw the example that Wojciech showed. He was using a few large language models, and there was a bit of a conversation in the chat as well about which tool is better to use. You could hook it up with GitHub Copilot if that's your poison. You could hook it up to GPT 3 and 4, 3.5 and 4, which are pretty decent at generating code. One thing that I like to emphasize is that throughout the talk, I emphasized a bunch of times that this process is the process of creating drafts for you. You are still the operator of the system. It is still, the onus is on you to make sure that whatever is generated is accurate, is doable, is et cetera, et cetera. It's just the fact that you went from an idea to something that you can test, you can read and verify in 15 minutes is the powerful point. The fact that would it run or not is something that you can either, like, if that's really the core of what you're trying to do, as Wojciech also said in the step of reflection, you could add unit tests and have it reflect on the code. Like, essentially try to run this piece of code you wrote. It failed this unit test. What needs to change about this code? So, when it comes back to regenerating tasks, one task can be added to the queue that says, this code that you generated didn't work, and my reflection says that this was the error. So now your new task is rewrite this module to run, right? So I said a lot of things, but the summary of it is that it depends on the tool that you ask it to use to write code, and then how you construct your reflection step to make sure that whatever is generated is executable, for example. It becomes a lot harder for things that don't involve testing code. Like, for example, if you ask it to give you a go-to-market strategy, right? Like, then one of the tasks is writing the 3 steps that you have to go through to engage mid-market level customers. Is that true or not? Like, how do you test that, right? So you could, for example, test for things like consistency. Like you might have said something before about selling to enterprises. Now all of a sudden you're talking about selling to mid-market. That's not consistent. So you could reflect and fix that at least. But for code, we are in a much better shape because we can ask the same system to write tests for us, write code, run mock data, run the code using the mock data on the test that it wrote, reflect on it, see why it didn't work, try it again.
Okay, makes sense. We have a left field question from Jack Martin. He said that should it be concerning for users of Sherpa, let's say, to have all your knowledge shared with your assistant, and your assistant be able to impersonate you?
Okay. Why would I be concerned about that? Isn't that a good thing? I always want to clone myself and have like 5 copies of me.
Mm-hmm.
So
Okay.
don't say anything. This is actually Sherpa talking. It depends. So joking aside, and I was joking to buy myself time to think, obviously. So that's a good question, but the answer really depends on the context. So as long as I have control over this agent and the data it has access to and what it does, then I wouldn't be concerned. If this assistant is sending all of the data about all of the ideas I'm trying to a third party, then that third party has access to all of my intellectual property. So more than impersonation, I would be worried about, other people mining my ideas and maybe throwing them into their autonomous agents and, building stuff with it, right? So I think that's a question that might need a bit of discussion. But there are, that's one aspect of it, but there are many other ethical questions that need to be asked and discussed about this, right? But what gives me hope is the fact that, again, like going back to Wojciech's talk, a lot of these tools could be local tools. Like, for example, I don't know, like instead of Notion, which is a cloud service, I could be using Obsidian, which is a file system based kind of place to take notes and keep track of those notes. So then I know that whatever I'm telling the system is being documented in Obsidian, which is on my file system, and nobody else has access to it. And then a model can sit on top of that and only fetch the pieces of information that is necessary for an interaction that I have. Very much like what we discussed with Wojciech in the previous talk. So that's a very good question. I'm babbling because I don't have a good answer for it, but these are at least my current thoughts about it.
Beautiful. I'd say Armin, or not Armin, Ahmed Shahrukh Ali really jumped on you. Like, I would like to see an example, and I know that you've hinted examples during bits of your talk, but is there like a magic moment example you can give for Ahmed and other folks listening?
Yeah, I mean, sort of this thing that I showed is, is something that happens very frequently. I probably have sent 15 to 20 proposals to people who ask me LLM questions. Like Amar yourself talked to Sherpa recently to answer somebody's question on our technical questions channel, right? So maybe I'll just pull up something quickly. There is a demo video that we created that we can share later for some more examples. But somebody reached out and with a question in the legal space, and I literally talked to the system for 15 minutes and generated this document that I sent to them. As you can see, this document has a lot of places that the information was not available. But the rest of it, like the summary, was auto-generated. Some of this information is copy-pasted, but like it gave me an implementation plan with the steps that I have to go through, time estimates for each of these steps, follow-up questions that I have to ask this client to know, more specifics about their projects. In principle, it could give me starter code, but I didn't want it to send them code right now, etc., etc. So that should give you a good sense of this. And we do have other agents in our system, other personas that can do other things, like a vegan chef that can help you convert your food to vegan, or a startup advisor that can challenge you on your startup idea, right? So.
Beautiful. We're gonna make an extra few seconds if anyone has more questions. You're very welcome, Ahmed.
There's a question from Yasin. So what does that say? Yep. There's no guarantee that this is actually me. So because of the glitches you saw. But the actual the question that Yasin is asking is, how does this overlap internal and external knowledge, right? And that's a fair question. But again, like, it goes back to the tool usage. So this Notion could be the internal company Notion instance, and that can contain all of your white papers, blueprints, etc., etc., right? It could have access to your internal GitHub instance, can have access to your code that way. But also it can access to Google. It can do search on Google. It can access the public instance of GitHub with code that is on there. And also the language model itself has, you cannot trust it as a knowledge base, but it does contain some knowledge. So in fact, it is really, you're really having it synthesize knowledge from all of these pieces. And these tools are only your way of selecting specifically which piece of information is most relevant for something that you're trying to do. So the whole purpose of the system is coming up with thoughts about what tasks are necessary, and finding information about, finding tools that can provide that information, calling those tools, getting them, and synthesizing them. And of course, you have to reflect to keep consistency. One thing that I kept open to show actually is something very interesting, which is, this is the AutoGPT repo. And again, like, we've been developing this independently, but this is what I can show you. If you can see, the prompts are partly engineered, but partly are being constructed dynamically. And that's a lot of people talk about prompt engineers, and I think that's a hype that will go away, because the thing that is a lot more exciting to do is dynamically generating prompts. And this is one good example of how that can be done. For example, in AutoGPT, they're dynamically constructing prompts by adding constraints. For example, you can only send 4,000 words. Don't send more things. If you're unsure about something, think about past. You might remember something interesting. Exclusively use the tools that I'm telling you about. If you finish the task, you can shut down. Then you can add commands to it, and commands are things like use a browser to surf the internet, or use Notion API to get a document from Notion, etc. Then it can be resources. So you can access internet to gather information. You can access your memory to find things. You can use GPT-3 to delegate tasks. Like, if the task is simple, you don't really need to go to a specific task handler, to a specific tool. You could just easily get it from there. And then evaluations, like, you can ask it to continuously review and analyze your actions to make sure you're performing. Self-criticize to get the big picture right. Reflect on the past and refine your approach, etc., etc., right? So it is doing a lot of, it is dynamically constructing the right prompts in a way that controls the behavior of the agent quite a bit. Is it perfect? Probably not. Is it as awesome as it looks, yeah. I mean, even I don't know if I have it open. Like it even has. I don't know if it is easy to find it quickly, but it even has. Let me spend 3 seconds, and if I don't find it, I'll move on. It even has things. Oh, there you go. It has things about budget. Like it is prompting it saying, "You're an expensive thing." So make sure I can find the prompt itself, or you can go and find it. It is prompting it saying you're expensive. So reduce the number of times you have to call you, right? Or you can even explicitly give it a budget and try to keep the project within the budget. So a lot of interesting things are happening here. My mind, I've been, designing a system, and we've been building a system like this, but my mind is blown. So yeah.
Okay.
I don't know if that answered the question, but I think I went on many tangents.
The person asking the question gave a thumbs up, so we'll take that as a yes. Let's do one last question before we go to break. It's from Andy Manel, and really the gist is, okay, I've done this initial brainstorming with Sherpa, and I have kind of sort of first draft idea come up. Now, what happens next? What's the collaboration that happens? Does it jump on Slack after that, or do you have something internally built into the tool?
Yeah. What I described here is mostly sort of like I'm happy that Wojciech gave that talk, because I can keep referencing that. So like in Wojciech's talk that we talked about open core, and then a specific engineering tools, components around it to tailor to different types of use cases. What I'm presenting here is a platform level idea. It is not talking about any specific use case. So you could now imagine, and I'm making up this, assisted on your phone when you're running, just to tell a story, really. But it could have many different shapes. So this could be a teaching assistant. Like this whole process could be a teaching assistant sitting in your Slack, connected to your university Blackboard, and then you interact with it. And the interaction can result in an action plan, but very much like what I said here, this is an iterative process, right? You go through 1, 2, 3, but then you can keep doing this. Like, for example, if it gives you an action plan and you're executing on that action plan for learning, and you come across a few GitHub repos that are very interesting, you could ask Sherpa to scrape those and keep them in mind, and then give you an updated version of the action plan. Or it might tell you to do an activity. You can come back and tell it, you told me to jump 6 feet high, and in my current physical situation, I can't. Then it can take that into account and update your action plan, right? So just talking to it once to create a draft is just the beginning. You're just priming it for, this is what I'm trying to do. You could always go back, talk to it more, and get it to produce more things. For example, in case of projects, an example that I gave was people reaching out to me asking LLM questions, and I'm sending them proposals. But a lot of the time they would come back and say, actually, you're making an assumption about the data, but really our data is videos. They're not transcribed yet. So what can we do about that? So I can go back to Sherpa and say, well, there's this new piece of information. So refine your action plan based on that. And it can do that. Hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you very much for your talk, Amir, and to everyone who had a chance to ask some questions. The next talk and the next talk that we have is by Fatime Mirish Gala. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. It starts with a 10-minute break. Beautiful.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Please reach out on LinkedIn or Slack if you have more questions. Happy to talk more. Thank you.
See you all in time.